I want to tell you the number first. $43,000. That is what my parents decided I owed them, not in a lump sum. They were practical people, strategic people, people who understood that the most effective way to extract something from someone is incrementally, in amounts small enough that the person being extracted from keeps second-guessing whether they have the right to object. $43,000 paid monthly over what they described as a reasonable timeline in exchange for, and I want to give you their exact language here because their exact language is important. Everything we sacrificed to raise you. I was 23 years old. It was the spring of 2014. I had been working at an accounting firm for 7 months, had received my first significant raise 3 weeks earlier, and had made the specific mistake of mentioning it during a Sunday phone call with my mother, Loretta, in the unguarded way you mention good news to people you have decided, against substantial evidence, to keep trying with. The demand arrived 4 days later. A letter, printed, not handwritten. My father, Wendell, had always understood that official-looking documents carry a weight that handwritten ones don't, that the appearance of formality implies the existence of legitimacy. It was 2 pages. It itemized things. Estimated costs of food, clothing, shelter, school supplies across the years of my childhood. It used the phrase return on investment in the 3rd paragraph. It used the phrase filial obligation in the 4th. It was signed by both of them, and at the bottom, in my father's particular handwriting, was a line that I have not forgotten in the years since. You didn't get where you are alone. It's time to acknowledge that. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table in my apartment that I paid for with the salary they now wanted half of. Then I went to the filing cabinet in my bedroom, the one I had brought with me from every apartment I had lived in since I was 17, the one that contained the documents that had traveled with me like a second spine, the evidence of a life I had built from materials no one had given me, and I took out a folder. Inside the folder were papers, legal papers filed in a county courthouse in the state where I grew up, dated 2007, the year I was 16. Papers that a judge had signed, that a lawyer had filed, that I had initiated and navigated and completed largely by myself, because the people who should have been guiding me through the architecture of my own life were busy extracting from it instead. Emancipation papers! I put the emancipation papers on top of my father's letter. I looked at them side by side on the kitchen table. The document that said you owe us for raising you, and the document that said, in the specific legal language of a family court judge, that I had been raising myself since well before the court made it official. And then I picked up the phone and called a lawyer, not to send a letter back, not to argue the filial obligation point or the return on investment framing or any of the itemized line items in my parents' 2-page accounting of my childhood. I called a lawyer because 3 weeks earlier, while filing my own taxes for the first time at a new income level, a discrepancy had appeared, a flag in the system, a question from my accountant that had sent me to records I hadn't looked at in years and had revealed something that made the $43,000 demand look like the smallest problem in the room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the childhood that my parents believed, with the specific conviction of people who have rewritten their own story so many times they've forgotten the original, that they had provided. My name is Imara Osei. I was born in 1991, the second of 3 children in a mid-sized city in the Midwest where my parents had arrived from Ghana in the mid-1980s with ambitions that were real and discipline that was real and a particular philosophy about children that I would spend the first 16 years of my life trying to understand and the years after that trying to recover from. The philosophy was this: children are investments, not metaphorically, not in the loose, affectionate way that parents sometimes say you're my greatest investment, meaning you're my greatest hope. Literally. Wendell and Loretta Osei had a specific and operational belief that the resources directed toward a child's upbringing constituted a loan, and that the loan came due when the child began to generate returns. I did not know this was unusual for a long time. Children don't arrive with a comparison point. The framework you're raised inside feels, for years, like the only framework that exists, not because you're naive, but because you're young and the people responsible for your worldview are the same people constructing it. What I knew, in the wordless way that children know things before they have language for them, was that love in our house had a ledger. That affection was distributed in proportion to usefulness. That my older brother Kofi, who was athletic and visible and brought the family the specific social currency of a son who excelled in ways other people could see, occupied a different position in the household economy than I did. That my younger sister Abena, who was beautiful and compliant, and had learned young that the path of least resistance was also the path of most reward, occupied a different position still. And that I, Imara, who was quiet and internal and more interested in understanding how systems worked than in performing within them, who had begun keeping her own financial records at 13 because something about the way money moved in our house didn't add up and she wanted to understand what didn't add up. I occupied the position of the child who noticed things she wasn't supposed to notice. Noticing things you're not supposed to notice is expensive in families like mine. It costs you the performance of normal that keeps the peace. It costs you the comfortable story. But it also, and this is what my parents never accounted for in their ledger, it builds something. The noticing builds a skill, a capacity for clarity that becomes, eventually, the most valuable thing you own. I started noticing in earnest when I was 11 years old, on a Thursday evening in the fall of 2002, in a moment that presented itself as ordinary care and revealed itself, years later, as the first clear evidence of the system I was living inside. My mother sat across from me at the kitchen table and helped me with my math homework. She was patient that evening, attentive. She explained the concept twice, waited for me to work through the problem, praised the answer when I got it right. It was, in the isolated snapshot of that single evening, what good mothering looks like. What I could not see at 11, what I understand completely now, was that the patience and attention arrived that week because I had won a regional academic competition the previous Saturday. That my mother's affectionate presence at the kitchen table was directly, causally connected to the public recognition my achievement had brought the family. That the affection was not for me. It was for the return. 3 weeks later, when I had produced no new visible achievement, the patience was gone. The kitchen table was somewhere she passed through rather than occupied. I was furniture again, present and unremarkable, waiting for my next moment of usefulness. I did not have the language for this at 11. I had a feeling, a persistent, low-grade, structurally important feeling, like a sound at a frequency just below hearing that you can't identify but that you know is there. The feeling that the warmth was contingent, that I was being loved conditionally and the condition was performance, and that the performance would never be sufficient because sufficient would end the incentive. I started keeping records that year, not of the emotional accounting. I didn't have the sophistication for that yet. I kept records of the practical things, the household expenses I could observe, the money that came in and where it went, the costs attributed to me versus the costs attributed to Kofi versus the costs attributed to Abena. I kept them in a notebook I hid inside a textbook on the highest shelf of my bookcase, and I updated them with the focused attention of a child who doesn't yet know she's doing accounting, but who knows with complete certainty that the numbers matter. I was right. They did matter. I just didn't know yet how much. By the time I was 13, I had been keeping financial records for 2 years and had developed 3 conclusions that I could not yet prove, but that I held with the quiet certainty of someone who has looked at the same pattern from enough angles to know it's a pattern and not a coincidence. The first conclusion was that the money my parents received, my father's salary from the manufacturing plant where he worked as a floor supervisor, my mother's income from the alterations business she ran from our basement, did not move through our household in the ways they described. When they talked about money, which was frequently and with the particular authority of people who have decided that financial stress is a legitimate parenting tool, they talked about scarcity, about sacrifice, about the cost of raising 3 children and the debt that cost incurred and the obligation that debt created. The language was constant and the scarcity was real in some ways. We were not wealthy, the house needed work. There were months that required careful management, but the specific numbers never matched. The scarcity they described and the scarcity that the actual household arithmetic produced were different sizes. The second conclusion was that the costs attributed to my education, my school supplies, my activity fees, the one extracurricular I was permitted, which was the academic competition circuit because it produced visible returns, were being discussed in conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear as something other than what they were presented to me as. They were being discussed as an investment strategy. I heard my father say once on the phone with someone I didn't know that Imara was the one worth putting money into because she would generate the highest return. I was 13. I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen and I heard my father describe me as a generating asset, and I felt something go very still and very clear inside me. The third conclusion was the one that took me 2 more years to fully understand: that the system I was living inside was designed to ensure that I could never fully leave it. That the language of debt and obligation and sacrifice was not incidental to my upbringing, but structural to it. That I was being raised with specific and operational intentionality to believe that I owed more than I could ever repay. Because a child who believes she can repay the debt and become free is a child with an exit. A child who believes the debt is infinite has none. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds, and I know the instinct to find an alternative explanation, to reach for the version where this is ordinary immigrant parent pressure misread by a sensitive child. I held that alternative explanation for years. I tried it on from every angle. What I kept returning to was the records. The actual numbers tracked over 4 years in a notebook hidden in a textbook, which did not support the alternative explanation, which supported, with the specific impartiality of documented evidence, exactly what I had concluded. The person who helped me understand what the records meant was a woman named Mrs. Claudette Archer. Mrs. Archer was my 8th grade English teacher, 51 years old, the kind of teacher who appears in certain children's lives at precisely the right moment and does the thing that changes everything. Not with drama, not with grand intervention, but with the simple and radical act of paying attention. She noticed in the fall of 2004 that I was writing essays about systems, about fairness, about the difference between what things are presented as and what they actually are. She called me in during lunch one Thursday and asked me what I was interested in. I told her I was interested in how numbers told the truth when people didn't. She looked at me for a long moment. "Where did that come from?" she asked. I thought about the notebook in the textbook, about my father's voice on the phone, about the warmth that appeared and disappeared in direct proportion to my visible usefulness. "Home," I said. She was careful. She did not ask me to elaborate in a way that put me in the position of accusing or performing or managing how the information would be received. She simply said, "Are you safe at home?" I had to think about what safe meant. "Physically," I said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "I want you to know something. There are people whose job it is to help young people in situations that are difficult in ways that aren't physical. If you ever want to talk to someone like that, you can come to me and I'll connect you." I thanked her. I did not take her up on it immediately, but I held the information the way you hold a key when you don't yet know which door it opens. 2 years later, I came back to Mrs. Archer with the notebook. By 15, I had been working for a year. Not officially. I was too young for official, but in the informal economy of a neighborhood where people needed things done and were willing to pay someone reliable to do them. I tutored younger students. I did bookkeeping for a small West African grocery store 2 blocks from our house, run by a man named Mr. Asante, who had hired me after watching me correct an arithmetic error in his handwritten inventory list without being asked. I ran errands. I babysat. I tracked every dollar earned and every dollar spent in a second notebook that lived alongside the first. And by the time I was 15, I had saved an amount that my parents did not know about because I had learned by then the specific skill of financial invisibility, of having resources without displaying them in environments where resources become leverage. What I could not hide was my academic record. My grades were, by any external measure, exceptional. I won competitions. I was being discussed by my 8th and 9th grade teachers as a strong candidate for academic scholarships, and as my external profile grew, so did my parents' investment language. The conversations I overheard became more specific, more forward-looking, more explicit about the timeline of return. My father began talking in 2005 about the percentage of my future income that would appropriately reflect the investment made in producing it. I was 15. I heard my father calculate the percentage of my future income. I went to Mrs. Archer the following Monday. I brought the notebooks, both of them. She read them at her desk during her planning period while I sat in the chair across from her, watching her face with the focused attention of someone who has put something irreplaceable into another person's hands and is waiting to find out if the hands are trustworthy. Her expression did not change dramatically. It became more still, more careful, the particular stillness of someone processing information that has weight. When she finished, she looked up. "How long have you been keeping these?" she asked. 4 years, I said. "The financial records. The second one for 14 months. "And your parents don't know about either." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "Imara," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Okay. Is what you're showing me here something you want me to help you document more formally?" she said. "Or is it something you're showing me because you've already decided what you want to do, and you need someone to help you understand if it's possible?" I looked at her. "The second one," I said. "What have you decided?" she asked. "I want to be emancipated," I said. The word had lived in my mouth for 3 months, since I had read about the legal process in a library book I had checked out under the pretense of a school project. I had read everything available on the subject. I understood the requirements, the process, the burden of proof. I understood what I would need to demonstrate and what I would need to have in place before I could demonstrate it. Mrs. Archer did not flinch, did not tell me I was too young to understand what I was asking for, or that my parents probably meant well, or that the family was complicated and I should give it time. She picked up the notebooks again and looked at the second one. The income and expense records, 14 months of meticulous documentation, and she said, "Can you support yourself financially if the court approves it?" "Yes," I said. "I've been doing it." She looked at the numbers. At the careful monthly columns, the savings total at the bottom, the projected income from the tutoring and the bookkeeping that Mr. Asante had indicated in a conversation I had documented, he intended to continue and expand. "Okay," she said. "There's someone I want you to meet." The someone Mrs. Archer wanted me to meet was a woman named Sylvia Okafor. Sylvia was 38 years old, a family law attorney who had grown up 3 neighborhoods from where I lived, the daughter of Nigerian immigrants who had their own complicated relationship with the specific intersection of cultural expectation and parental authority. She had gone to law school precisely because she had understood, early, that the law was a language and that people who did not speak it were consistently at the mercy of people who did. She ran a small practice from an office above a dry cleaning shop on the east side of the city, and she had an arrangement with the school district. Informal, uncompensated, the kind of arrangement that exists because certain people decide that certain work needs to be done regardless of whether it pays, whereby teachers like Mrs. Archer could refer students in difficult situations. Mrs. Archer called her on a Tuesday. I met Sylvia on a Thursday. I brought both notebooks. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Sylvia read the notebooks the way Mrs. Archer had, with careful stillness, with the particular attention of someone whose professional life had trained her to understand that documents tell stories that people cannot always tell safely out loud. She asked clarifying questions at specific intervals. She did not tell me my parents meant well or that I should give it time. What she did, with the methodical precision of someone who has done this before and understands exactly what is required, was begin to assess the case. "Emancipation in this state requires 3 things," she said when she had finished reading. "Proof that you can support yourself financially, proof that emancipation is in your best interest, and proof that your current living situation is either harmful or untenable." She looked at me across the desk. "The financial proof is here." She touched the second notebook. "The best interest argument is here." She touched both notebooks. "The third element is the one that requires the most care." "Because it means making a formal record of what my parents have done," I said. "Yes," she said. "Once this process begins, it cannot be undone quietly. There will be a court date. There will be testimony. Your parents will be notified and will have the opportunity to respond." She paused. "I want you to understand fully what you're initiating before you decide to initiate it." "I've understood it for 3 months," I said. "I've been preparing for it for longer than that." She looked at me for a moment with the particular assessment she had been applying since I walked in, evaluating not just the case, but the person bringing it, the specific maturity required to navigate what came next. "How old are you?" she said. 15, I said. "I'll be 16 in 4 months." "We'll file after your birthday," she said. 16 is a stronger position procedurally. She closed the second notebook. "In the meantime, I want you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Document everything. Every dollar earned, every dollar spent, every conversation that's relevant. I want a record so complete that there is no version of the hearing where what you've built doesn't speak for itself." "I've been building that record for 4 years," I said. She almost smiled. "I know," she said. "That's why you're sitting in this office." The 4 months between that Thursday meeting and my 16th birthday were the most disciplined months of my life. And I want to be specific about that word, disciplined, because I think the way it's used in stories like this often flattens what it actually means. Discipline is not the absence of difficulty. It is the presence of a structure you have chosen, maintained in the ongoing presence of difficulty, because you understand that the alternative costs more. I was 15 years old, still living in my parents' house, still performing the version of myself that the household required, the compliant, visible, academically producing daughter who did not cause problems, who came home on time, who sat at the dinner table and passed the bread and managed the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been doing it since childhood. I was maintaining that performance while simultaneously building the legal case for why I should be legally recognized as the person primarily responsible for my own life. The performance cost something every day. I want to say that clearly. There was nothing romantic about it. I was 15 and I was tired, and there were evenings when I sat in my room with both notebooks open on my desk and the weight of what I was carrying pressed down on me with a completeness that had no name, and I thought about the alternative. About simply staying, simply performing, simply accepting the framework I had been born into and hoping it would eventually become something more bearable. I thought about the percentage. My father's voice on the phone. The word return. Then I picked up my pen and updated the records. The person who helped me survive those 4 months, beyond Sylvia and Mrs. Archer, was Mr. Asante. Emmanuel Asante was 61 years old, had run his grocery store for 22 years, had raised 4 children of his own, and had the particular quality of wisdom that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from having developed a long and honest relationship with it. He did not know the details of what I was planning. What he knew was that I was a 15-year-old girl who showed up reliably, worked carefully, kept records with a precision that impressed him, and occasionally had the look of someone carrying something heavy. He asked me once in January of 2007, when I was updating his inventory records after school on a Wednesday, whether I was all right. "I'm working on something," I said. "Something good?" he asked. "Something necessary," I said. He nodded, did not ask further. 2 weeks later, he told me without context that he intended to formalize my bookkeeping role and increase my rate, and that he would be happy to provide documentation of my employment to anyone who needed it for any purpose. He never asked what purpose. He just made the offer and let me decide what to do with it. I have thought about Emmanuel Asante many times in the years since, about the particular grace of someone who sees what a person needs and provides it without requiring the person to explain why they need it. It is a rarer quality than it sounds. It is one of the qualities I have tried in my own adult life to practice. I turned 16 on a Saturday in April of 2007. Sylvia filed the petition the following Wednesday. I want to tell you about the hearing, which happened 6 weeks later on a Thursday morning in a county courthouse. I want to tell you about it specifically because I think the version of legal proceedings that lives in most people's imaginations, dramatic, confrontational, the truth arriving like weather, is different from the actual experience of sitting in a courtroom at 16 while a judge reads documents about your life with the careful neutrality of someone whose job is to determine what is true. My parents were there. Of course they were there. They had been notified, had retained their own lawyer, a man named Graves, who was efficient and slightly contemptuous, and who had clearly decided that the most effective strategy was to reframe the emancipation petition as the misguided action of a confused teenager who had been improperly influenced by adults with an agenda. I sat beside Sylvia at the petitioner's table, and I looked at the courtroom with the focused calm of someone who has spent 4 months preparing for this specific room and knows exactly what is in the documents that the judge is reading. My mother looked at me from the respondent's table with an expression I had not seen before. Not anger. Anger was familiar, manageable, a known variable. This was something more complicated, something that, if I had been less careful, I might have mistaken for hurt. What I understood, watching her face with the attention I had been training for 4 years, was that it was not hurt. It was recalculation. My mother, who had spent 16 years operating a system that depended on my not understanding it, was sitting in a courtroom looking at evidence that I had understood it for years and had been quietly, methodically preparing for this moment. She was recalculating what that meant for everything she had planned. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Tran, 54 years old, with the particular demeanor of someone who has seen a great deal and has developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting when a narrative is constructed and when it is real, read the documents for 40 minutes before she said anything substantive. When she looked up, it was at me, not at either of the lawyers. "You've been managing your own finances for how long?" she said. 4 years, Your Honor, I said. "Formally documented for 14 months. And this employment with Mr. Asante, how long has that been ongoing?" 14 months, I said. Prior to that, informal tutoring and errand work for approximately a year. She looked at the notebooks. Sylvia had submitted them as exhibits, the 4 years of financial records reproduced in organized, tabbed documentation. "These records were kept by you." "Yes, Your Honor." "Beginning at age 11." "Yes." She looked at them for another moment. Then she looked at the respondent's table, at my parents and Mr. Graves, with an expression that was professionally neutral and contained underneath the neutrality, something that I read as a decision already forming. Mr. Graves made his argument. It was competent and it was wrong. Not legally wrong exactly, but factually wrong in the way of a narrative that has been constructed to be persuasive rather than to be true. He described my parents as devoted and committed, my home as stable and supportive, the petition as the result of adolescent misunderstanding and outside influence. He used the word manipulated in reference to me and the word concerned in reference to my parents, and I sat beside Sylvia and I was very still, and I looked at Judge Tran and I watched her face as she listened. Her face did not indicate that she was being persuaded. Sylvia presented the case with the economy of someone who has learned that the most effective argument is the one that requires the least embellishment. She did not need embellishment. She had 4 years of documented records, a letter from Mrs. Archer, a formal employment confirmation from Mr. Asante, and a 16-year-old girl who had demonstrated with the specific clarity of organized evidence that she had been functioning as a self-supporting adult for considerably longer than the law required. When it was over, when both sides had presented and the courtroom had settled into the particular quiet of waiting, Judge Tran looked at her documents one more time. Then she looked at me. "Miss Osei," she said, "I'm going to ask you one question and I want you to answer it without thinking about how it sounds. Just tell me the truth." "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "Why do you want to be emancipated?" I had prepared answers to many questions. I had not prepared an answer to that one. Sylvia had told me to prepare for procedural questions, evidentiary questions, questions about my financial capability and my living situation. Not this one, not the simple, direct question underneath all the documentation. I thought about the percentage, about the notebook in the textbook, about the warmth that appeared and disappeared in proportion to my visible usefulness, about the word return. Because I want my life to belong to me, I said. And right now, it doesn't. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Tran wrote something on the document in front of her. "Petition granted," she said. "Emancipation at 16 does not feel the way I expected it to feel. I want to be honest about that, because I think the stories we tell about legal victories, about the moment the gavel comes down in your favor and the world reorganizes into something just and navigable, tend to skip the part where you walk out of the courthouse into an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and the air is the same temperature it was when you walked in, and nothing looks different, and you are 16 years old and legally free and completely uncertain what free actually means in practice." Sylvia walked out with me. We stood on the courthouse steps in the May sunlight, and she said, "How do you feel?" "Like I should feel more," I said. "That's normal," she said. "The feeling catches up later. Right now, your nervous system is still in the courtroom." She was right. The feeling caught up that evening in the apartment of my mother's cousin Afia, who had agreed, after a conversation with Sylvia and Mrs. Archer that I had not been present for, but that Afia later described as the most direct conversation two women had ever had with her, to let me rent her spare room at a rate I could manage on my bookkeeping income while I finished high school. I sat on the bed in Afia's spare room, which was small and had a window that faced a parking lot and was the first space in my life that was not managed by my parents' economy. And I felt something move through me that I can only describe as the physical experience of exhaling something you have been holding for a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly. Something more foundational than either. The specific structural sensation of a weight that has been distributed across every surface of your daily existence being, all at once, removed. The body's recognition that it no longer needs to be constantly braced. I cried, alone, in Afia's spare room with the parking lot window for approximately an hour. Not from sadness, from the specific release of 4 years of careful, sustained, expensive discipline, finally arriving at the destination it had been building toward. Then I washed my face, updated my records, and started planning what came next. What came next was the rest of high school, managed with the same methodical attention I had applied to everything before it. I finished my junior and senior years while working for Mr. Asante, who had expanded my role to include supplier negotiations. A development he described as practical, and I experienced as the first professional education I had ever received. I took every AP class my schedule could hold. I applied for every scholarship I qualified for, using Mrs. Archer's letter and Sylvia's documentation and the organized records of my academic history as the foundation of applications that told, with the specific force of documented truth. A story of a person who had built her capabilities without institutional support. I received a full academic scholarship to a state university with a strong business program. I enrolled in the fall of 2008. I studied accounting, which surprised exactly no one who had known me longer than a month, and which felt less like a professional choice than like the formalization of something I had already been doing for 6 years. My parents did not attend my high school graduation. I had not invited them. We had not spoken since the courthouse, or rather, they had attempted contact twice, through my Aunt Afia, and I had responded through Sylvia with a brief and legally precise communication indicating that I was open to contact but not to negotiation, and that any contact which involved financial demands or the language of obligation would be directed to my legal representative without response. They had not attempted contact after that. I carried this through high school and into university, the way you carry a complicated thing when you have decided that the carrying cannot be the primary activity of your life. I thought about them. Of course I thought about them. They were my parents, the people who had given me life and had structured that life around their own ledger. And the specific grief of that paradox is not something that resolves because a judge signs a document. It travels with you. It changes shape over time. It becomes, if you're willing to do the work, something you can hold without being held by. Dr. Patience Nuama helped me with that. She was a therapist I found in my sophomore year of university, a Ghanaian American woman in her 40s whose specific understanding of the cultural dimension of what I had come from, the immigrant family framework, the investment language, the filial obligation architecture, meant I didn't have to spend the first 10 sessions explaining context. She understood the context. We could go directly to the thing itself. "What do you need from your parents that you haven't received?" she asked in our third session. I thought about it with the honesty her directness required. "I don't know if it's about what I need from them anymore," I said. "I think it's about what I needed and didn't get and have had to build for myself, and figuring out what to do with. The anger about that." "What does the anger feel like?" she asked. "Like a second set of records," I said. "Accurate and comprehensive and not serving any current purpose." She looked at me. "Records can be closed," she said, "when the accounting period is over." I sat with that for a long time. I graduated from university in 2012 with a degree in accounting and a GPA that had held steady through 4 years of full-time study and part-time work, because full-time study and part-time work was the only mode I had ever known. I was hired by a mid-sized accounting firm 7 weeks after graduation. I was promoted 18 months later. I received the raise that I mentioned to my mother on a Sunday phone call, the call that led to the letter, the itemized 2-page demand, the phrase "return on investment" in the third paragraph. And this is where the story returns to where it began, because I need to tell you what my accountant found. I had gone to my own firm's resources for the amended filing. The discrepancy that appeared when I filed my taxes at a new income level was small, a mismatch in historical records, the kind of thing that only surfaces when someone looks carefully at the full arc of a financial history. My accountant, a meticulous woman named Gloria, who had the particular professional thoroughness of someone who treats every return like it contains a story worth reading, looked carefully. She called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. "Imara," she said, "I need to show you something." She turned her monitor toward me. On it was a tax record, not mine. Or rather, not filed by me. Filed using my social security number, my name, my date of birth. Filed as a dependent for tax years 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2012. 6 years. 6 tax years in which my parents had claimed me as a dependent on their federal tax returns. 6 years in which they had received the specific financial benefits that come with a dependent claim: the deductions, the credits, the adjusted taxable income. 6 years that began in 2007, the year I was emancipated. The year a judge had signed a document making me legally independent, making me legally no longer their dependent, making it not just factually, but legally inaccurate to claim me as anything other than what I was, a self-supporting adult who had been recognized as such by the family court of this state. My parents had received the emancipation papers. They had been present in the courtroom. They had heard Judge Tran say petition granted, and they had gone home and filed me as a dependent on their taxes for the next 6 years. I looked at Gloria's monitor for a long moment. "This is fraudulent," I said. "Yes," Gloria said, "it is." "For 6 years?" "Yes." Starting the year I was emancipated. Gloria's expression had the careful neutrality of a professional who is delivering significant information and allowing the recipient to process it without editorial overlay. "Yes," she said. "Starting that year." I thought about the letter on my kitchen table, the 2 pages, the itemized costs. You didn't get where you are alone. It's time to acknowledge that. I thought about 6 years of tax filings. 6 years of my name and my social security number producing financial benefit for 2 people who had been told by a judge that I was not their dependent. 6 years of claiming me as theirs after a court had confirmed I was mine. I thought about the word return. "I need to make some calls," I said. "Yes," Gloria said. "You do." The first call was to Sylvia Okafor, who had kept my file because Sylvia kept everything. The second call was to an IRS fraud reporting line, which I will not describe in detail because the process is detailed and bureaucratic, and the important thing is not the process but what the process revealed. The third call was to a lawyer, a different lawyer, a tax attorney named Howard Park, who had been recommended by Gloria and who had, upon reviewing the 6 years of fraudulent filings, an expression that moved from professional neutrality to something I could only describe as a slow, focused outrage on my behalf. "They received the emancipation papers," he said. "There's no ambiguity about their knowledge." "No," I said, "there isn't." "This is not a gray area," he said. "This is not creative accounting or aggressive deduction strategy. This is filing a fraudulent return with knowledge that the filing is fraudulent, repeated 6 times over 6 years." "Yes," I said. He looked at me with the focused attention of someone who has just understood the full architecture of a situation. "You said they sent you a letter," he said, "demanding half your salary." "Yes." 4 days after you mentioned a raise." "Yes." "While they were in year 6 of fraudulently claiming you as a dependent." "Yes," I said, "while they were in year 6 of fraudulently claiming me as a dependent." Howard Park was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the specific precision of someone choosing language very carefully, "I want you to understand what your options are here. What you have in this documentation is significantly more than a defense against their demand. What you have is a case." I looked at him across the desk, at the monitor behind him, still showing the 6 years of fraudulent filings, at the 2-page letter in the folder beside me, with its itemized costs and its filial obligation language and the handwritten line at the bottom. "You didn't get where you are alone. It's time to acknowledge that." "Tell me about the case," I said, and I listened to every word. "There is a particular kind of power that arrives not loudly, but precisely. Not the power of a raised voice or a slammed door or a confrontation staged for maximum emotional impact. The other kind. The kind that comes from sitting across a desk from a tax attorney who is explaining, in careful and specific language, that the people who spent 16 years telling you that you owed them everything have spent 6 years committing a federal crime using your name. The kind that comes from watching the architecture of someone else's narrative. The sacrifice, the investment, the filial debt, collapse under the weight of documented evidence, the way structures collapse when the foundational material turns out to be something other than what was claimed. Howard Park laid it out methodically, the way good attorneys lay things out, not for drama, but for clarity. The 6 fraudulent tax filings represented, in recoverable damages and penalties, a figure that was not small. The specific credits and deductions my parents had claimed improperly across those 6 years had reduced their tax liability significantly. The IRS, upon investigation, would seek recovery of those amounts plus penalties plus interest. Additionally, because the filings had used my Social Security number and my identity without my knowledge or consent, there were elements of identity fraud woven through the tax fraud. A complication for my parents that extended the potential legal exposure considerably. "What do you want the outcome to be?" Howard asked. This was the question he had come back to 3 times across our 2 meetings, and I understood why he kept returning to it. Because in situations like this, the outcome you pursue is as much a reflection of who you are as a reflection of what the law permits. And a good attorney wants to understand both before proceeding. I thought about it with the honesty it deserved. The anger was there. I will not pretend it wasn't. Will not perform a serenity I hadn't fully arrived at yet. 6 years of my name. 6 years of my Social Security number. 6 years of a court-recognized independence being quietly, systematically monetized by the same people who had built the framework that made independence necessary. The anger was real, and it was appropriate, and I did not apologize for it. But underneath the anger was something more durable, something that had been there since the notebook in the textbook, since the Thursday meeting with Sylvia, since the courthouse steps and Afia's spare room, and 4 years of building an accounting career with the focused attention of someone who understands that the most powerful position is the one built on accurate numbers. "I want the truth to be the record," I said, "not just between me and them, the actual legal record. I want there to be a document, official, permanent, filed, that says what they did and what it was." Howard nodded slowly. "And their demand? The letter?" "I want it answered," I said. Completely and permanently. In that case, Howard said, I'd like to bring in a colleague. The colleague was a woman named Adaora Mensah, and she was, in the specific way of people who appear at precisely the right moment, exactly what the situation required. Adaora was 44, a civil litigation attorney who specialized in family financial disputes, with a particular focus on cases involving immigrant family structures and the specific legal complexities that arose when cultural expectations of financial obligation collided with American law. She was also Ghanaian American, which meant she understood, not academically but from the inside, from the particular interior knowledge of someone who has navigated that specific intersection, the cultural architecture of what my parents had built and what they had expected it to produce. She and Howard worked together on cases that overlapped tax and civil law, and what my situation represented, Howard had explained, was exactly that overlap. The tax fraud was the IRS's jurisdiction. The demand letter, the $43,000 claim, the filial obligation language was a civil matter and Adaora's area. We met on a Thursday morning, all three of us, in Howard's office, and Adaora read the demand letter with the same careful stillness that Mrs. Archer had applied to my notebooks 8 years earlier. When she finished, she set it down on the desk and looked at me. "Have you responded to this?" she said. "Not yet," I said. "I was referred to Howard before I responded, and Howard brought you in before we proceeded." "Good," she said. "Do not respond directly. Any response to this letter will come from us, and it will contain certain information that I believe will end the conversation permanently." "What information?" I asked. She looked at Howard, then back at me. "The fraudulent dependency claims create a specific legal dynamic in relation to this demand," she said. "Your parents are claiming you owe them for raising you. The 6 years of fraudulent filings represent a situation in which they were compensated by the federal government for claiming to have raised you during years when a court had already determined you were raising yourself." She paused. "The demand and the fraud cannot coexist as positions. They are mutually contradictory in a way that is legally significant and personally complete." I sat with that for a moment. The specific geometry of it. The letter that said you didn't get where you are alone, sitting beside the filing that said, "This child is our dependent," sitting beside the court document that said this child is legally independent, had a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like the truth finally achieving its correct shape after years of being pressed into something smaller. "What does the response look like?" I asked. Adaora opened her briefcase and removed a document. "Like this," she said. I read it. It was 4 pages. It was the most precise document I had ever read, which is a significant statement from someone who had spent 4 years studying accounting and 7 years building a professional relationship with financial documentation. Every sentence carried weight. Every paragraph did specific, targeted work. It laid out the fraudulent dependency claims, the years, the amounts, the legal exposure. It referenced the emancipation order by case number and date. It noted, with the careful restraint of a document that does not need to raise its voice because the facts are loud enough, that the demand letter represented an attempt to collect a debt from a person who had been legally recognized as self-supporting since age 16, by parties who had simultaneously been collecting federal tax benefits by fraudulently claiming that same person as their dependent. It closed with a single paragraph that I will not reproduce verbatim, but which communicated, in language so precise it had the quality of a door closing, that any further contact regarding financial demands would result in the immediate referral of the fraudulent tax filings to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, in addition to a civil suit for damages arising from the fraudulent use of my identity and social security number. I read it twice. Then I looked at Adaora. "Send it," I said. The response arrived from my parents' lawyer 11 days later. Not Mr. Graves, a different lawyer, someone they had retained specifically for this matter, which told me that they had understood immediately what the letter meant and had sought counsel accordingly. The response was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph denied the characterization of the tax filings as fraudulent, using language that was careful enough that I could see the shape of the defense strategy underneath it. The second paragraph made no mention of the $43,000 demand. The third paragraph expressed in the particular vocabulary of legal correspondence that is trying to close a door without admitting why, a desire to resolve the matter without further proceedings. Adaora read it to me over the phone. "What does that mean in practice?" I asked. "It means they understand their exposure," she said. "The demand is gone. They won't bring it again. The question now is whether you want to pursue the civil damages or whether withdrawal of the demand is sufficient for your purposes." I thought about what I had told Howard. I want the truth to be the record. "The IRS investigation proceeds regardless?" I said. "Yes," Adaora said. "We've already reported. That process is independent of any civil action you do or don't take. They will be contacted by the IRS regardless." "Then I don't need the civil suit," I said. "The record exists. The IRS has the documentation. Their lawyer knows what they did, and they know their lawyer knows. That's enough." "Are you certain?" Adaora asked. There was no pressure in the question. She was asking because she wanted to be sure I had genuinely arrived at the decision rather than performing resolution I hadn't reached. "Yes," I said. "I spent a long time keeping records because I understood that the truth of a situation is the most important thing to have documented. The truth is documented. That's what I needed." A pause. "That's a mature position," she said. "I've had a lot of practice," I said. "The IRS investigation took 14 months. I was not the primary party in the investigation. I was the injured party, the person whose identity and social security number had been used, and the proceedings were largely conducted without my direct involvement. Howard kept me informed at each significant juncture. The investigation confirmed the 6 years of fraudulent filings. My parents were required to repay the improperly claimed benefits plus penalties, plus interest, which amounted to a figure that I did not seek to know precisely because knowing precisely was not something I needed. What I needed, what I had told Howard 3 times across 2 meetings, was the record, and the record existed, permanently, officially, filed in the relevant federal system. The truth of what had been done with my name. My sister Abina called me during the investigation. She was 20 at the time, still living at home, navigating our parents' household with the compliance strategy she had always used, and her call had the careful, managed quality of someone who has prepared what they are going to say and is monitoring how it lands. "They're very upset," she said. "I imagine they are," I said. "Dad says you—" She stopped. "He says you betrayed the family." I thought about the emancipation papers, about the 6 years of dependency filings, about the 2-page letter with its itemized costs and its handwritten line at the bottom. "Abena," I said, "do you want to know what actually happened? Not what they've told you. The actual documented sequence of events?" A pause, long enough to contain several things. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I do." I told her, carefully, completely, without editorializing. Just the sequence, the documents, the dates, the specific things that had been done and when. I told her the way I had been trained through 12 years of keeping records to tell the truth, factually, in order, with evidence. When I finished, Abena was quiet for a very long time. "I didn't know about the tax filings," she said finally. "Most people didn't," I said. "Imara?" She stopped again, started differently. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm asking it genuinely, not on their behalf." "Okay," I said. "Are you okay?" she said. "Not legally, actually, okay." The question arrived with a warmth I hadn't expected from her, a directness that felt like something new, like a version of my sister that had been there underneath the compliance strategy, waiting for a context in which it was safe to be direct. I felt something shift in my chest, small, insignificant. "I'm getting there," I said. "Honestly." "Good," she said. "I'm glad." A pause. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening when we were kids." "You were a kid," I said. "So was I. We worked with what we had." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment for a long time, in the specific quiet that follows a conversation that has rearranged something. not fixed everything, not resolved the complicated grief of a family that had treated its children as line items on a ledger, but shifted something, opened a space. Abena and I began talking regularly after that, carefully, with the tentativeness of two people who have grown up in the same household and discovered, in adulthood, that they had experienced it very differently and are now trying to find the common ground between their different truths. It was not easy. It was real, which is more important than easy. My brother Kofi, the firstborn and the favored, did not call. I had not expected him to, and I did not require it. Some relationships have been too long defined by the economy of the family that produced them to find their way to something different without more time and distance than we had yet accumulated. I held the possibility open. I did not wait at the door. What I thought about most in the months following the investigation's conclusion, the question I returned to in the quiet hours, in the therapy sessions with Dr. Nuama that had continued through everything, in the long walks I took through the city on Sunday mornings, was not the fraud or the demand or the legal proceedings. It was a simpler and harder question. What does it mean to have been raised by people who loved you and extracted from you simultaneously? Because both things were true. I want to be honest about that complexity, because I think the honest version of this story is more useful than the clean one. My parents loved me in the way they understood love, which was shaped by their own histories and their own frameworks and the specific pressures of building a life in a country that was not the one they had grown up in. Their love was real. It was also insufficient in ways that caused damage. Both things were true, and neither canceled the other, and learning to hold both without letting either collapse into the other was the work that Dr. Nuama helped me do, and that I am still, in some measure, doing. What I know with certainty is this: the love does not excuse the extraction. The history does not justify the fraud. The difficulty of their lives does not transfer the cost of that difficulty to a child who did not choose it and was not compensated for carrying it. These are not complicated positions. They are simply true, and the truth of them is what the records had always been about. Not accusation, not revenge, but the simple, foundational insistence that things be what they actually are. That insistence had cost me my childhood's easy comfort and given me everything else. I had stopped, by the time the investigation closed, being certain whether that was a fair trade. I had started, by the time the investigation closed, being certain that the question was not the right question. The right question was not whether the cost was fair. The right question was what I was going to build with what I had. And I already knew the answer to that one. I am 23 years old at the beginning of this story, and I am speaking to you now from a little further on, from a vantage point that has the particular clarity of distance without the distortion of complete removal, close enough to the fire to know exactly how hot it was, far enough from it to see the shape of the whole thing. And I want to talk to you directly, not as a narrator wrapping up a story, as a person who has been where some of you are, or where some of you have been, or where some of you are afraid you are heading, who has sat at a kitchen table with a demand letter that put a number on her childhood, and has looked at that number and understood, with complete and specific clarity, that the number was wrong. Not just legally wrong, fundamentally, structurally, humanly wrong. So let me say the things I wish someone had said to me. Not at 23, when the Emancipation Papers were already 7 years old and the records were already built, and I already knew, in the practiced way of someone who had been doing the accounting for a long time, what the truth was. Earlier, at 15, in the spare chair across from Sylvia Okafor's desk. At 13, standing in the hallway hearing my father describe me as a generating asset. At 11, at the kitchen table with the math homework and the contingent warmth and the first faint frequency of the sound I couldn't quite hear but knew was there. If your family treats you as an asset, I need you to understand something first. That is not love. It resembles love in some of its surface features. It involves attention, investment, the direction of resources toward you, but it is structurally different from love in the most important way. Love does not calculate return. Love does not keep a ledger. Love does not require you to perform usefulness in order to receive warmth. What your family is practicing, if what I have described is familiar to you, is not love with conditions attached. It is something else wearing love's clothing, and the distinction matters because you will spend years, I spent years, trying to earn something that was never actually on offer, working toward a warmth that was never going to be unconditional because unconditional warmth was never the product being sold. You cannot earn your way out of a framework designed to make you feel you owe more than you can pay. The framework is the problem, not your performance within it. If you are young and in a situation that is harmful in ways that are not physical, in ways that are financial, emotional, structural, in ways that leave no visible marks but that you can feel in the specific weight of every day inside that house, I want you to know that help exists in forms you may not have been told about. Emancipation is real. It is a legal process that exists precisely because the law recognizes that parents are not always what children need them to be, and that some children have been functioning as adults long before any court makes it official. You will need documentation. Start now. Not because you have decided what you are going to do, you don't have to have decided, but because documentation is the language, the systems that can help you actually speak. Write down what happens. Write down the dates and the amounts and the words used. Keep the records somewhere safe. The records are not accusation. They are simply the truth, preserved in a form that can be understood by people whose job is to help. And find your Mrs. Archer. Find the adult who is paying attention, who asks the right questions without requiring you to perform the answers, who connects you to the next thing without making the connection contingent on your gratitude. They exist. They are in schools and community centers and libraries and small law offices above dry cleaning shops. They are looking for you the way you are looking for them, and the finding happens when you are willing to let someone see the notebooks. If you are an adult and your family has presented you with the bill for your childhood, in whatever form that bill takes, whether it is a demand letter or a guilt campaign, or the slow, sustained pressure of obligation language deployed across years of Sunday phone calls, I want you to understand what you are actually holding. You are holding a document that tells you more about the person who sent it than about the debt it claims you owe. You are holding evidence of a framework that was installed in you without your consent, designed to ensure that you could never fully leave, that the exit would always carry a cost large enough to make staying feel preferable. You are holding someone else's accounting of your life, prepared without your participation, using numbers that were never accurate. You do not owe it, not the money, not the compliance, not the performance of gratitude for a childhood that cost you more than it gave. What you owe, what I believe we owe, those of us who survived childhoods like this and built lives in the cleared ground, is the truth. Not to our parents, to ourselves. The truth of what happened, documented in whatever form we can hold it, preserved against the revision that families like ours are always attempting. The truth of what it cost and what it gave, and what we built from the materials we had to find ourselves. That truth is not for them. It is for us. It is the record that says we were here, we were real, we saw clearly, and we built anyway. The Emancipation Papers are still in my filing cabinet. Not the originals. Sylvia has those in her archive, filed with the careful permanence she applies to everything. What I have is a copy, printed on ordinary paper, the ink slightly faded in the years since I first carried it from courthouse to apartment to the filing cabinet in the bedroom of the place I live now. It sits behind the tax documentation and ahead of the correspondence from Howard and Adeora, in the section of the cabinet I think of as the record of what happened, the organized, tabbed, chronological account of a life that had to be documented in order to be defended. I look at it sometimes, not often, more the way you check a compass than the way you dwell on a wound, not because I have forgotten where I came from, but because the confirmation of the direction I have traveled is its own kind of steadiness. At the top of the first page, in the formal language of a family court filing, is my name, my age at the time, the date, the case number, and at the bottom, in Judge Tran's handwriting, is the word that changed everything. Granted, one word. The law's way of saying, this person is real, this person is capable, this person has demonstrated the right to her own life, and we are recognizing it. One word that I had earned, that no one had given me. That arrived at the end of 4 years of notebooks and 14 months of documented income and a Thursday meeting with a woman named Sylvia and a hearing in a courtroom and a 15-year-old girl who told a judge, without preparation, the truest thing she knew. I want my life to belong to me. It does now, completely, legally, financially, structurally. It belongs to me in every form that belonging can take. If yours doesn't yet, if you are still inside the framework, still managing the room, still performing the compliance that keeps the peace at a cost you cannot keep affording, I want you to know that the exit exists. It is not easy. It will cost something real. The people who built the framework will tell you that the cost of leaving is higher than the cost of staying, because people who build frameworks that extract from others always manage the exit. They are wrong. I kept the records. I found the people who could read them. I sat in the right chair at the right desk at the right moment and said the true thing out loud. And I have been building from that moment forward on ground that is actually mine. You can too. Start the notebook.